is just saying yes to everyone the best behavior if my goal is really helping as many as I can? This question of like, it actually takes a lot of sincerity with ourselves to be like, what am I really after, in this serving? Am I serving because I'm afraid what will happen if I say no? But then we're acting more out of fear than out of a kind of generous love.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Optimal Work podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, thanks for coming back on.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, of course. We kind of had to have you back because we did last week the first episode in a series on generosity. So it's kind of we're obligated now to do the second episode.
We promised that there would be a second one.
So
yes,
here we are.
So you're stuck with me.
Yeah,
here.
Okay,
that's right,
great. That's right. And so in the last one, we covered true generosity. So these good forms of being generous. And this time, I wanted to dive into false generosity and maybe some potential problems people could fall into while they're striving to be generous.
Sounds great. Let's dive in.
Yeah. Well, actually, even before covering these false forms of generosity, we wanted to discuss, what prevents people from being generous in some instances, right?
Yeah, and that might be kind of the same idea that maybe it's better to say there are false ideas about generosity. And that those false ideas are what prevent us from being generous. So, and I think that we all have these fears that if we are focusing so much on our own trying to be more generous, then are we going to end up somehow not as well off? Are we going to somehow be the loser by being the giver? I think that's what we're afraid of, right? That somehow giving is going to bring about some kind of loss. You can imagine someone working in a company where if they're always giving credit to others, well, maybe they don't get the promotion. Maybe they don't get the bonus because they were so generous in giving. And so I think when we look at I see as fundamentally, there are a few reasons that we can be afraid of giving and see it as potentially threatening. And the first is that it could lead to our being exploited by others, or at least not benefiting as much as we could have. And so there's some loss of benefit to ourselves. I think another way is that we could feel that we're going to lose all personal boundaries. That if we're always putting the good of others, like in the first place, we end up maybe losing our sense of self and we kind of blend with others. And so sometimes, you talk about codependency, or there's this kind of unhealthy loss of boundaries between people. And then the third is just this idea, very closely related, which is that we will create dependency in others. And they'll come to rely on us in a way that's not actually in their own best interest. Adverse reliance, you could call it. So I think those are the real concerns, that bringing up a topic like generosity might stir up in us.
Yeah, maybe we could just take those one by one then. So exploitation is interesting. One example that comes to mind is, at work, you often are working on your own project. So you're trying to be generous in, delivering something of value to the team, the company, whatever it is. And then also at the same time, you'll have colleagues come ask you for help with their projects, or you're asking them for help with your projects. So it can be tough, I think, to navigate, okay, what's generous here? Should I be super generous in helping this person with his or her project, or should I be generous by really, completing my own project well? And so there's this judgment that has to take place. And if we're totally just helping our colleagues, then we can never accomplish our own tasks. then we're not really doing what we were hired to do, for instance. So how do you think about that?
I feel like I've had it happen myself where I've gotten requests for help that are a bit of a test of like generosity, in the sense that I would love to be able to give to all who ask, right, and to be able to be generous with everyone. But there can be times where I could be asked by 10 people in one day for help with a very complicated problem. So I've had to be very clear about boundaries, and so and that there are certain ways of self-giving that just would not be sustainable. That you wouldn't be able to work, you wouldn't be able to eat or sleep if you're always trying to. And so I think that this is something I've thought a lot about. What does it mean to be a wise giver? And so anyways, that might be one lens in which to kind of be thinking of this. There's actually been a lot of talk lately about the Ordo Amoris, the order of love, and but I've had to say that as a setting, generosity is about love, and it's about being loving with people, and that means it is particularly those people who rely on you because you have a bond with them. So if there's an existing bond that you have with others, those people have a kind of prior claim, on our generosity. And then you can try to be as generous as you can in a sustainable way with others, but it kind of depends a lot on the nature of the bond. And so I think that parents have a particular kind of, generosity that needs to be lived with their children, and that they wouldn't have for other people's children. And you might have a duty to stay home if you have a sick child, but necessarily if your neighbor has a sick child, you wouldn't have a duty to stay home. And so it's kind of built into the law that there's, that people have different kinds of claims on us. And so what I've also learned is that many times people don't need a very in-depth kind of, you don't have to take over and make all the decisions for them. You don't have to get you can just give people sometimes general direction and say that's as much as I can do. Or to give them some resources that they can look more into and say that's, yeah. And so that there are generally ways you can always give, but how much you give is going to depend a lot on the nature of the bond. And maybe that's the main point to emphasize, that generosity is within the context of bonds, the bonds that we have with others. And if we experience those bonds with others as actual bondage, as shackles, then we're going to see generosity as a threat. And we're going to think that everything should be 50-50. It should be transactional, even Steven. Let's just make sure that I don't give any more than the other person gives. But I would say that's actually contrary to the nature of a bond. Because a bond is built by being generous with our care and attention. And so we're giving our care and attention, to the others. And then they reciprocate by giving their care and attention. And so, there's something about responding well to the gifts that others make by giving ourselves back. And that's how we form bonds. And so I think that you have to understand generosity in the first place in the context of bonds.
That's great, Kevin. So does generosity then always have to coexist with a kind of trust? I mean, for instance, in the case of a team at work, I mean, if you're generous with your time, with your colleagues, then you kind of have to trust that they're going to be generous with you so that it all kind of works out in the end? Or is that a lack of generosity?
Well, I think that trust is essential to every bond. And so you're trusting that they are good enough to respond in kind, and that if you treat them lovingly, they treat you lovingly. If you were to treat someone lovingly and they were to treat you with some kind of disregard or contempt or total lack of gratitude, then that would be a big problem for the bond. But here's where you have to think, how do we actually improve the quality of our bonds with others? So you can't control other people, but you can, on your end, try to really give your best in the context of that bond. Give your best care and attention and interest, right? And that does actually correlate with having healthier and stronger bonds, where then others are more likely to be giving you that back. And there might be a bit of a lag, but even if, the others don't immediately reciprocate, we are still the first to benefit when we give our attention generously to others. There's a fascinating study that was done on that question. There's David Craig and Jennifer Chevins. They're at The Ohio State University, and it was just published like a year ago. And it's on healing through helping, I think is the title of it. But it was a study where they put people into 3 groups. There's like 120 people or so. And so a third of them went into this, they were encouraged this was a study of kindness, actually. That's very close to generosity, and to acts of kindness. And it was like to perform 3 acts of kindness in a day for others, at least 2 days a week. And another group was a CBT group where they did thought records. I won't go into that right now, but they're basically analyzing their thoughts, trying to like correct any maladaptive thoughts they have. It's an old style of reframing without ideals. And so it's CBT 2.0, not 3.0. And then there is a control group. And actually, no, the third group was to plan enjoyable activities at least twice a week with friends. And so they looked and studied how the people were doing in terms of anxiety and depression and all these other metrics. The group that's focused on being kind to others had the greatest improvement on all the metrics. And which is interesting, it actually beat the old CBT method for producing gain. They had healthier bonds, and it was mediated through a decrease in self-focus. That was the biggest changer, was that by being less focused on themselves, they actually ended up having much less worrying and ruminating. And a much more enjoyable time with others, and actual growth in bonds with others. And that was a study that took place over 5 weeks. And then after 5 weeks, they saw that the kindness group maintained all the gains. So it's a 10-week study, but still it's an interesting signal, right? And it proves this point in some way, that when we are doing good, focus on doing good to others, we are the first to benefit by not being so focused on ourselves. The sure way of being miserable is having yourself be the focus of your attention 24/7. So that everything is just done to make yourself comfortable. That we know doesn't work.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support.
If we understand bonds are a big part of flourishing, like that we need, then generosity improves the quality of bonds and does lead to flourishing. But you can't be too concerned about tit for tat.
So, it sounds like that intervention is a little bit like CBT 3.0. I don't know if you'd agree with that. The deliberate acts of kindness.
Absolutely. Yeah, because it's committing to an ideal. Yeah. Yeah, and that gets to this idea too about boundaries. Like, am I losing myself when I focus on generosity? And it's no, you're actually finding your best self. That when we're generous with others, we're able to live every ideal because bonds are the setting for the growth in every ideal. So, we, as an atom existing in the universe on our own, we wouldn't be able to grow in the ideals. Like, how could you be reliable unless there's people relying on you? And how could you could go through, like, how could you be caring and thoughtful, without people that require some degree of caringness and thoughtfulness. Anyway, so the bonds are the setting for living every ideal. So our bonds allow us to become the best version of ourselves.
Mm. So, Kevin, just before we move on to the boundary point, which let's get to that shortly, on the exploitation point, so how would you, just to wrap up that one, how would you summarize how people should think about this? Because I kind of got a little bit of the picture, like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about being exploited. Or is it more nuanced than that?
I think it's that we do have to be, this gets to the question actually of adverse reliance. Like, is our way of helping others hurting them? If it's not, if we're genuinely helping others, put it this way, if people were taking advantage of us, would that be helping them in any way? So if we're like enabling people to exploit us, is that bringing out their best? So only if we're focused on particular kinds of outcomes or results would we think that we're actually helping people. So real generosity has to be aimed at bringing out the best in the other person. So, and exploitation of us is not their best. So I think that this is idea that generosity is always a perfection of prudence. So, and it's taking what's prudent and making it loving is another way of putting it. So if others were determined to take advantage of us, giving them that opportunity would not be loving. It wouldn't be doing anything that would be in their best interest. That we have to think, are we really helping the other? And if we're enabling them to exploit us, then we're not actually helping them.
So if someone asked me a question that I would have to Google the answer to, and they could have just Googled the answer to it, then it wouldn't be generous to myself Google the answer and then pass that along to them. I should encourage them and help them.
Well, if it's like a one-off thing, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so if it's a one-off thing, maybe it's a little act of generosity to ask Google or ChatGPT for the answer and then paraphrase it back to them. But if it keeps happening, then we might have to tell them how we did it. I remember once, someone asking me, like, could you give me a list of references on this point, this research point? And so it's like, wow, I felt like I was being given a research assignment by email by someone who has never met me. And so I just went to ChatGPT and asked for a list of references and then put those in. But this was back before I knew that how much it hallucinates references. So then they came back to me and they're like, oh, some of these don't exist. I'm like, well, here's what I did. So maybe you can maybe you can do this. So I had to like own up to it. So after that, I learned it's better not to do that directly. But if I can find one good, if I respond, because I can't respond to everyone, but if I were, I would like find one real reference that is actually good by people I know, reference that, but then I wouldn't encourage it for the future.
That's great. That's funny. So, okay, we've kind of covered exploitation and got started on dependency. I don't know. Do you want to finish talking about dependency and then do boundaries?
I think with boundaries, the main thing is that we actually are becoming our best self. But because generosity allows us to intensify every ideal. That's a point we made before in talking about true generosity. And so to be more generous in being caring or thoughtful or kind intensifies each of those ideals. And you can be more generous in being wise and in being prudent. And so always we are going to be more fully, you could say, self-actualized by trying to transcend ourselves, the Maslow stuff that you brought up last time. So I think that it gets to this idea, we're not going to be losing our sense of self. We're not going to be losing our boundaries with others, particularly if we're thinking of, are we truly helping them to be the best version of themselves? So again, these ideals perfect everything. And I see generosity as one of these perfecting ideals in that it perfects every other ideal. And it's it's a transformative ideal in that sense. So much so that if we just focused on generosity, we would naturally be led, I think, to the practice of every ideal.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. That gets to my next question because, as you know, we're working on some new developments for our app, website and mobile app, and it involves goal setting. And one of the things that we're going to be encouraging people to do is have like a weekly theme or weekly ideal or weekly goal that's oriented around a particular ideal. Yeah. Sincerity, generosity, patience, kindness, etc. So then, do you think generosity is a good goal for people to be focusing on? To say, hey, my ideal this week that I'm working on is generosity. where you said,
Hmm.
okay, actually it applies to every ideal. So does that make it a really good ideal to work on or a really bad ideal to work on?
Well, it certainly needs to be concretized in some way. And so if we find that focusing on generosity gives us lots of conclusions, there's like all these immediate conclusions we can draw, like, ooh, okay, maybe I need to change how I do that. So it's a nice lens to bring to any question. It's not the only lens, uh, but one of the kind of powerful things about generosity as an ideal is it can be one of the best flags when we try to examine our behavior. And so I know for myself, at the end of the day, if I were to look and see, where was I particularly noticing a lack of generosity? Was there anything here that I could have responded more generously to? In my experience, it is so fruitful at unveiling all these other ways I could have been growing and I could have been exercising myself. Generosity a lot keeps us in a zone of more optimal growth. Because our growth really depends, like think of muscle growth. Muscle growth depends on the degree of stretching and soreness that came. It's only by exercising the muscle that you grow it. But that's exactly what generosity has in focus. It's the kind of stretch that's involved. That's the point of generosity. Mother Teresa said, give until it hurts. But that's true then in living every ideal. To be thinking of anything you would like to grow in. Is there any point of stretch that you would like to aim at? But this also gets to the idea that this does not mean maximal or extreme. Trying to lift 1,000,000 pounds isn't going to make you build muscles better than because that's not how you maximize stretch. Now, I guess it would be isometric, right? But if there are actually there is a kind of weight that produces the maximum kind of stretching, that actually does produce the maximum amount of growth. So there's a reasonableness built into generosity if you're thinking of it as this kind of stretch and living an ideal. Because if you were to go way beyond what you could do or even should do in living some action, you would lose the stretch. It would just be impossible. And so I think there's something with generosity keeps it right at the limit of where growth is occurring. So where is the best stretch occurring? And the more that becomes second nature, the easier it is for us to keep up a pace of growth.
Mm. Do you find that ever in people that you're dealing with that, wow, this person is trying to be too generous? I mean, they're like overdoing it. What does that look like?
But that's the funny thing about too generous. What would that mean? Does that mean that they're trying to stretch themselves excessively?
I guess I would think about, someone at work and they're not even finishing their work because they're always helping other people do their work. So it's I guess this is a person who's giving into this kind of exploitation in some way, feeding it.
Yeah. And so I think that when we're thinking of generosity as this way of stretching ourselves according to our ideals, so that every challenge, really each day, brings out our best. It is inherently flexible and wise to be thinking in those terms. So I think what happens is if we equate generosity with any given behavior, that behavior could be done too much. We could become rigid and inflexible in the way we like being generous. And so there are all these distortions that can come. But none of those have this sense of balance and flexibility and suppleness that true generosity has when we try practicing it. So it might be that you could get over-focused on one ideal or on one way of being generous. And so maybe being generous, we have to, there are times when if we think our generosity is not really benefiting others the way we would hope, it's not helping them to be more reliant, or if it's not, or somehow it's costing us too much, if it's taking away from our needed self-care and our own duties in our job, then I think that we would need some kind of deep strategic reset to make sure that it actually is true generosity.
So what you just mentioned strategic reset. Kevin.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah. Strategic reset is when I have identified that there's some vicious cycle taking place. Like the more I say yes to helping others, then the more they give me to do, and the less time I'm able to do is, to give to doing it. And maybe there's a vicious cycle that could happen where you do less and less of your own work and more of other people's work, but that's not sustainable. So you might need to see, like, wait a second, I need a reset here. Most of the time then it's like, what goal was I really seeking? And then did I really choose the best behavior to get there? Is just saying yes to everyone the best behavior if my goal is really helping as many as I can? Or could there be this question of, like, it actually takes a lot of sincerity with ourselves to be like, what am I really after, in this serving? Am I serving because I'm afraid what will happen if I say no? But then we're acting more out of fear than out of a kind of generous love, which is generosity is about loving, being loving in the context of a bond, helping others to grow the most. And we grow the most as we do that.
It seems like that could be what's happening with someone, say, I guess one way of a false generosity would be violating the order of love that you mentioned earlier. Yeah. So if you're, always, doing everything, going above and beyond at work to such an extent that you don't have time, that you're, missing out on important time with your family, that could be a violation then of that order of love. And it would be, then you would have to ask yourself, okay, why am I doing this? Am I being so, contributing so much at work? Is it because, well, I'm afraid of some kind of consequence there, or trying to please people there?
Yeah.
And
that's exactly right. And if you think of it, even within, say, a business setting, what you owe the person who has hired you and is in charge of paying you is actually different than what you owe others who are also being paid. So there is there's a hierarchy even there. And so if you're being unjust with the person who has hired you, then you can't really be doing justice overall. If you're not fulfilling your own duties because you're helping others in what's not your duty. So there is this fundamental thing there that our relationships are not all of equal importance and weight. And so if we live this, so with it would be a disordered love, a disordered generosity, that focus on giving in one setting, but then deprived our ability to give our best in a more important setting. So I think that's a very important goal. The question though, like, do I have a goal that's unworkable? And is it really more about how I am I'm more afraid of conflict? I'm afraid of asserting myself. Is there really a motive of fear that is masquerading as generosity? That's, I think, the first big question. And then the second is, like, what's the cost of my current way of behaving? Which is really, what's the long-term cost? And that's where a lot of these unsustainable ways of giving or unwise ways of giving are just not sustainable in the long run. And so, but if we're putting order in our priorities, giving our best within these relationships as is due to them, then we can in the long run also be flourishing and helping others to flourish. And many times when we're doing something unworkable, we can tell in the long run, like if we're creating adverse reliance, we're stopping people from doing their own jobs. Instead of teaching them how to fish, we keep giving them fish. Well, that creation of dependency shows that there's some short-term vision that's trumping a long-term vision.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, this is really helpful guidance. We're basically out of time at this point, though. So I don't want to promise a third episode just yet, but I don't know if you have any final brief thought you want to end on.
It's just that, the idea of, like, why we sometimes do need a reset in our strategies is precisely so that we can ask, are we actually giving in the wisest way? Could we be giving more wisely? Could we be more flexible in how we think about generosity? Could we, So anyway, I think that there are these ways that, to see true generosity has the effect of helping strengthen our bonds with the most important, people in our lives. It's really how we give of ourselves in the context of a bond. And then we, in fact, benefit from it as well.
Wonderful. All right. Thanks so much, Kevin.
All right. Thank you, Sharif.
All right. We'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.